The body found rotting in an abandoned New York tenement was so ravaged by heroin and rats that police buried him as a homeless John Doe. It took nearly 2 years and a fingerprint match to realize the horrifying truth. This corpse was Bobby Driscoll, the Academy Award winner and the voice of Peter Pan. He didn't die from a lack of talent. He died from a betrayal. When the Wonder Child committed the unforgivable crime of hitting puberty, developing acne and a cracking voice, Walt Disney cut his strings and threw him away like a broken toy. Cast out by the man he viewed as a father and blacklisted by Hollywood as damaged goods, he fell from the magic kingdom into a heroin nightmare. This is the story of how the boy who taught the world to fly was left to die in a pauper's grave. But to measure the terrifying distance of his fall, we must look away from the horror of the tenement and rewind to the blinding golden light of post-war California. The story of Bobby Driscoll is the story of a specific kind of American cannibalism, where we feed our dreams to our children and then punish them when they get full. It begins with a miracle of biology. Bobby was born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1937 into a world that was dusty, practical, and grounded. He was the only son of an insulation salesman and a former school teacher, a normal child in a normal town. But when the family moved to Los Angeles in 1943, following the migration of hope toward the Pacific, something shifted. It started in a barber shop. It is almost a cliche of Hollywood mythology, the chance encounter. But for Bobby, it was the moment the trap was set. A barber, while trimming the boy's hair, remarked to his father that the child had a face that belonged on a screen. It wasn't just that he was cute. Plenty of children were cute. It was that he possessed a startling, almost unnerving openness. His eyes were wide and liquid, capable of transmitting emotion with a clarity that most adults spent decades in acting school trying to master. He didn't look like a child acting, he looked like a child feeling. His father, perhaps driven by curiosity, or perhaps by the subtle greed that infects parents in the proximity of fame, took him to an audition at MGM for a bit part in a drama called Lost Angel. Bobby was 5 years old. He stood in front of the camera, the massive lights bearing down on him, and he didn't flinch. He looked into the lens with a curiosity that read as profound intelligence. He got the part. The roughly 2 minutes of screen time were enough to ignite a fuse. The industry, always hungry for the next vessel of innocence, took notice. But it was Walt Disney who saw the full potential of the vessel. In 1946, the Disney studio was an empire of ink and paint, the undisputed king of animation. But Walt was restless. He wanted to expand into live-action filmmaking to capture the real world with the same control he exerted over his cartoons. He needed a bridge. He needed a human face that could embody the Disney brand. Wholesome, mischievous, innocent, and undeniably American. He didn't want a child actor who could tap dance or tell jokes. He wanted a child who could break your heart just by looking at a butterfly. When Walt met Bobby, the connection was instant and electric. Walt was a man who curated his reality meticulously, and in Bobby, he found the perfect raw material. Bobby was respectful, sharp, and eager to please. He was quickly signed to a contract, becoming the first human being to be officially owned by the Walt Disney Company. This was not merely an employment agreement. It was an adoption. Bobby was brought into the fold, given the run of the Burbank lot, and treated as the crown prince of the Magic Kingdom. His debut for the studio was Song of the South in 1946. While the film would later become a lightning rod for racial controversy, effectively buried by the studio in modern times, at the moment of its release, it was a sensation. And at the center of it was Bobby Driscoll. Playing Johnny, the wide-eyed boy who learns life lessons from the animated Brer Rabbit, and the very real Uncle Remus, Bobby was luminous. He held the screen against seasoned actors and animated chaos alike. He possessed a naturalism that was startling. When he laughed, it bubbled up from his toes. When he cried, it was a jagged, gasping sorrow that made mothers in the audience want to reach through the screen and hold him. Critics raved. They called him the Wonder Child. But the most important critic was the man with the mustache in the corner office. Walt Disney loved him. He referred to Bobby with a proprietary pride, often inviting the boy to lunch in his private office. Imagine the psychological weight of that honor. To a 9-year-old boy, Walt Disney was not a CEO. He was a wizard. He was the architect of dreams. To be chosen by him, to be fed sandwiches at his desk while he talked about storyboards and future projects, was to be told that you were special, that you were safe, and that this love was permanent. Bobby thrived in this artificial sunlight. He worked tirelessly, moving from Song of the South to So Dear to My Heart, becoming the face of the studio's live-action ambitions. He was the prototype for the Disney kid, the template that every subsequent child star, from Haley Mills to Lindsay Lohan, would be measured against. He was polite to the press, he learned his lines perfectly, and he never complained. He was a professional in short pants, carrying the financial expectations of a major corporation on his small shoulders. The apex of his artistic achievement, however, came not in a Disney film, but in a loan out to RKO for a noir thriller called The Window in 1949. This film proved that Bobby was not just a cute kid, but a prodigy of dramatic acting. The premise was dark. A boy who is known for telling tall tales witnesses a brutal murder, but no one believes him. He spends the movie being hunted by the killers through a crumbling tenement, a grim foreshadowing of the very place where he would eventually die. The role required Bobby to exist in a state of high-octane terror for nearly 70 minutes. He wasn't singing with cartoon birds. He was trembling in shadows, sweating, his eyes darting with the primal fear of a prey animal. It was a performance of terrifying vulnerability. When the film was released, it was a sleeper hit, and the acclaim for Bobby was universal. The New York Times called him startling. The industry acknowledged that this wasn't just a child performing tricks. This was an actor. In March 1950, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded him a juvenile Oscar. He stood on the podium clutching the miniature statuette, a tuxedoed miniature of a man. He smiled that winning, gap-toothed smile, the flashbulbs popping like fireworks. He was 12 years old. He was rich, he was famous, he was loved by the most powerful man in Hollywood. He had climbed the mountain unaware that the peak was actually the edge of a cliff. The danger of building a life on the foundation of childhood is that childhood is, by definition, a terminal condition. It is a temporary state. The industry loved Bobby Driscoll because he was a boy. They loved his soprano voice, his smooth cheeks, his small stature. They loved him because he was unthreatening and malleable. But biology is the one force that a contract cannot negotiate with. As the 1950s dawned, Bobby was given the role that would immortalize him and destroy him, Peter Pan. It was a project Walt had been nurturing for 15 years. He needed a voice that could carry the weight of a legend. He needed a boy who could be cocky, vulnerable, selfish, and heroic all at once. Bobby was the only choice. He spent months on the soundstage, not just recording the dialogue, but acting out the entire film in costume as a reference for the animators. If you watch Peter Pan today, you are watching a ghost. The tilt of the head, the way Peter sits in midair with his hands on his knees, the specific sneer of defiance. That is Bobby Driscoll's physical vocabulary translated into ink. He poured his soul into the boy who wouldn't grow up. He gave Peter Pan his laugh, his swagger, and his hidden sorrow. But while he was playing the boy who stopped time, time was rapidly catching up to Bobby. Puberty hit him with the subtlety of a freight train. It wasn't just that he grew taller or that his voice began to crack and waver, betraying the soprano purity Disney required. It was the face. The soft round features of the wonder child began to lengthen. The nose grew sharper, the cheeks hollowed out. And then the acne arrived. It began as a few spots, easily covered by makeup, but soon bloomed into a severe cystic case that defied the best efforts of the studio's cosmetology department. They layered pancake makeup on him until his face felt like a mask, but under the hot studio lights, the texture was visible. To a normal teenager, this is a painful rite of passage, a source of embarrassment in the high school hallways. To Bobby Driscoll, it was a violation of his contract. He was damaging the merchandise. The studio executives looked at the rushes and saw a problem. They didn't see a young man growing up. They saw a product expiring. The cute kid marketability was evaporating, and there was no protocol for what came next. Walt Disney was a man of strict binaries, fantasy and reality, useful and useless. He had built his empire on the control of image. Mickey Mouse did not age. Donald Duck did not get pimples. But Bobby Driscoll was human, and his humanity was becoming an inconvenience. The lunches with Walt stopped. The open-door policy at the executive building was quietly rescinded. The warmth that Bobby had interpreted as love was revealed to be conditional approval, and the condition was eternal youth. He was still working, still trying to please, but he could feel the temperature dropping. He was becoming a stranger in his own home. He was the prince who had suddenly grown too large for the castle, and the walls were beginning to close in. He didn't know it yet, but the golden age was over. The exit was approaching, and it wouldn't be a grand farewell. It would be a cold, silent ejection into a world he was completely unprepared to navigate. The boy who had flown past the second star to the right was about to crash, land in the unsparing reality of adolescence, where no amount of pixie dust could hide the scars of becoming a man. The year 1953 did not begin with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of a latch locking into place. The rejection that Bobby Driscoll faced was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a bureaucratic erasure, silent and absolute, carried out with the efficiency of a corporation balancing its books. The day he drove up to the Alameda gate of the Walt Disney Studios marked the precise moment his life split into two distinct eras. The time before the gate, when he was a god, and the time after, when he was a ghost. He was 16 years old, driving a car he had bought with his own earnings, wearing clothes paid for by his own labor, approaching a workplace that had been his second home for half his life. When the security guard stepped out of the booth, Bobby rolled down the window, expecting the usual wave, the familiar smile, perhaps a joke about the weather. Instead, he was met with a look of pity that is far worse than hatred. The guard, a man Bobby likely knew by name, didn't raise the barrier. He simply consulted a clipboard and delivered the sentence. There was no meeting scheduled. There was no badge waiting. The studio had exercised its option to terminate his contract early. The reason was never spoken aloud at the gate, but it was written on Bobby's face. He had committed the crime of puberty. The cruelty of the moment lay in its silence. Walt Disney, the man who had sat Bobby on his knee, who had treated him like a surrogate son, who had used Bobby's own soul to animate Peter Pan, never called. There was no exit interview. There was no handshake. The machinery of the Magic Kingdom simply stopped turning for him. He had been evicted from Neverland not because he wanted to leave, but because he no longer fit the costume. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion collapse of identity. For a child actor, the studio is not just an employer. It is a parent, a school, and a church. It defines who you are. Without the badge, without the call times, without the script, Bobby Driscoll was just a teenager with bad skin and a high voice, living in a house purchased with money he was no longer earning. The silence in the Driscoll household was deafening. His parents, Isabel and Cletus, were simple people who had been swept up in the tornado of their son's fame. They had grown accustomed to the lifestyle, the deference of neighbors, the steady stream of checks. Now the checks had stopped, and the golden goose was sitting on the sofa, looking at the phone that refused to ring. Desperate to normalize his life, his parents made a decision that, in hindsight, was akin to throwing a lamb into a pack of wolves. They enrolled him in a public high school. First, he attended the Hollywood Professional School, which was somewhat insulated, but eventually he transferred to University High School in West Los Angeles. This was the real world, the world he had been protected from by tutors and sound stages. He walked into the hallways of University High expecting, perhaps naively, to be treated with the same adoration he received from fans. He was wrong. High school's a brutal caste system, and Bobby Driscoll was an anomaly that the ecosystem could not tolerate. To the other boys, he was the Disney sissy, the rich kid, the has-been. They didn't see an Oscar winner, they saw a target. The bullying was relentless and physical. He was taunted for his roles, mocked for his voice, and ridiculed for the acne that was destroying his confidence. He had spent his life learning how to cry on cue and how to hit a mark, but he had no idea how to navigate the social violence of the American teenager. Bobby tried to adapt using the only tool he had left, money. He tried to buy his way into the tribe. He would flash rolls of cash in the cafeteria, buying lunch for entire tables of strangers. He treated friends to movies, to clothes, to drugs. He was trying to purchase the applause that the studio had taken away. But friendship bought is not friendship. It is prostitution of the soul. The hangers-on took his money, drank his sodas, and laughed at him the moment he turned his back. He was more isolated in a crowded cafeteria than he had ever been on a soundstage. It was in this vacuum of connection that he found his new co-star. It didn't have a face or a voice, but it offered a performance that never failed. At 17, seeking an escape from the mockery of the schoolyard and the silent disappointment of his parents, Bobby Driscoll discovered heroin. It started, as it often does, with the softer drugs, marijuana, pills to stay awake, pills to go to sleep. But Bobby was a person of extremes. He had lived a life of high saturation, of intense emotional peaks. Reality was too gray, too slow, too painful. Heroin offered a solution. It provided a warm, numbing blanket that smothered the anxiety. It turned off the noise. When he was high, he wasn't the washed-up child star. He wasn't the disappointment. He was floating. It was a sensation not unlike flying. Only this time, he didn't need wires. The transformation was rapid and terrifying. The discipline that had made him a professional actor, the ability to focus, to work long hours, to memorize, was repurposed for the acquisition and consumption of narcotics. The wonder child became a street hustler. The face that had charmed America began to change, not just from age, but from toxicity. His eyes, once bright and intelligent, grew glassy and pinned. His skin took on a gray, waxen pallor. He tried to keep working, but Hollywood is a small town with a long memory and loose lips. The word was out. Bobby is a junkie. Bobby is unstable. He managed to secure guest spots on television shows like Dragnet and Rawhide, but the roles were humiliating reflections of his own decline. He was no longer cast as the hero or the innocent. He was cast as the troubled youth, the delinquent, the addict. He was essentially playing himself, capitalizing on his own destruction for a paycheck. In one particularly cruel twist, he appeared in an episode where he played a young man caught in a downward spiral, and the pain in his eyes was so real it made the audience uncomfortable. They weren't watching acting anymore. They were watching a documentary. In 1956, the law finally caught up with him. He was arrested for possession of marijuana, a charge that, in the conservative climate of the 1950s, was enough to end a career permanently. The headline, "Disney star arrested on narcotics charge," ran across the country. It was the first time his name had been in the papers, without a mention of a new movie or an award. The public was horrified. They didn't want to see Peter Pan in handcuffs. They didn't want to know that the boy who sang about the second star to the right was shooting up in alleyways. In a frantic attempt to prove he was a man and to stabilize his life, Bobby eloped. He married Marilyn Jean Rush in Mexico. He was 19. She was 19. It was a desperate grasp at normalcy, a play acting of adulthood. They had 3 children in quick succession, but a baby cannot fix a broken man, and a marriage cannot cure an addiction. The chaos of his internal life spilled over into his home. The money was drying up. The residuals from his Disney work were non-existent. Contracts in those days rarely provided for long-term royalties for talent. He was supporting a wife, 3 children, and a heroin habit on the sporadic income of a pariah. The downward spiral accelerated in the late 1950s. The arrests became more frequent. He was picked up for battery, for disturbing the peace, for check fraud. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and Paul was a drug dealer. The final blow to his reputation came in 1961 when he was arrested for robbery. The details were sordid, a desperate smash and grab to feed the sickness. This time, the judge decided that the wonder child needed to be made an example of. Bobby Driscoll was sentenced to the Narcotic Rehabilitation Center of the California Institution for Men in Chino. It was a prison. The irony was Shakespearean. The boy who had once had the run of the most famous studio in the world was now locked in a cage with hardened criminals. The prince of the Magic Kingdom was now inmate number A-68789. Chino was a brutal awakening. There were no retakes. There were no stunt doubles. Bobby was stripped of his name, his clothes, and his dignity. He spent 6 months in the facility surrounded by violence and despair. In later interviews, he would describe this time not with bitterness, but with a haunting resignation. He said that in prison, for the first time since he was 5 years old, he was nobody. He wasn't the Oscar winner. He wasn't the disappointment. He was just another number. In Denham, there was a strange, perverse comfort in that anonymity. He didn't have to smile. He didn't have to be cute. He just had to survive. When he was released in 1962, he emerged into a world that had completely moved on. The 1960s were swinging. The culture was changing. Disney was busy making Mary Poppins. Nobody was looking for Bobby Driscoll. He was a relic, a piece of nostalgia that had curdled. He tried to find work, but the convict label was even stickier than the child star label. The studios were closed to him. The agents wouldn't take his calls. He stood in the wreckage of his life in Los Angeles, the city that had built him up and torn him down, and realized there was nothing left for him there. Every street corner held a memory of what he used to be. Every palm tree looked like an accusation. His marriage had collapsed under the weight of his addiction and incarceration. His children were growing up in the shadow of his failure. He needed to run. He needed to go somewhere where Bobby Driscoll didn't mean anything, or perhaps where it meant something different. He looked east. He looked to New York City. He heard whispers of a new scene, an underground movement where broken people were making art, where Andy Warhol was turning trash into gold, where the freaks were the stars. He thought perhaps he could reinvent himself. He wouldn't be an actor. He would be an artist. He would be a poet. He would find a new Neverland in the concrete canyons of Manhattan. So he packed his meager belongings. He left the sun, the ocean, and the ghosts of the studio lot behind. He boarded a bus, or perhaps thumbed a ride, heading toward the Atlantic. He was running away from home just like the Lost Boys, but he wasn't flying toward an adventure. He was fleeing a crime scene, unaware that the victim of the crime was himself, and that the killer, the addiction, was traveling in the seat right next to him. There's a photograph taken of Bobby shortly after his release from Chino. In it, he is leaning against a wall, a cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers. The boyish roundness is gone, replaced by a gaunt skeletal sharpness. His hairline is receding, but it is the eyes that stop you. The eyes are ancient. They are the eyes of a man who has seen the machinery behind the curtain and realized that the wizard is a fraud. He looks at the camera not with the eagerness of the child star who wants to please, but with the flat, dead stare of someone who knows. The camera steals a piece of you every time the shutter clicks. He had given them everything, his childhood, his innocence, his sanity, and in return they had given him a plaque and a prison record. As he turned his back on Hollywood and set his face toward New York, he was carrying a darkness that no amount of city lights could illuminate. The curtain had fallen on the first act of his tragedy. The second act would be played out not on a sound stage, but on the cold, unforgiving pavement of the Lower East Side. New York City in the mid-1960s was not a city of dreams. It was a city of grit, a sprawling concrete machine that hummed with a dangerous electric energy. It was a place where the old world was crumbling and something new, chaotic, and terrifying was rising from the cracks. For Bobby Driscoll, stepping off the bus into the gray smog of Manhattan, it was supposed to be a sanctuary. He had fled the sun-bleached judgment of Los Angeles, hoping that the dense crowds of the East Coast would offer him the one thing Hollywood never could: anonymity. He arrived with a suitcase, a few dollars, and a desperate hope that he could reinvent himself. He was 28 years old, but his internal odometer had rolled over twice. He carried the baggage of a lifetime lived in public: the Oscar, the arrests, the prison time, the failed marriage. He wanted to shed the skin of Bobby Driscoll, the Disney kid. He wanted to be Robert Driscoll, the artist. He wanted to be judged for what he created with his hands, not for the face he was born with. He gravitated towards the Lower East Side. In 1965, this was not a neighborhood of boutiques and expensive coffee shops. It was a war zone of tenements, immigrant families, artists, junkies, and revolutionaries. It was the epicenter of the counterculture, a place where rent was cheap and questions were few. Bobby blended in. For the first time in his life, his ragged appearance, his gaunt face, and his nervous energy didn't make him a pariah. They made him a local. He found a small, squalid apartment. He set up a makeshift studio. He began to make art. It wasn't the kind of art that Disney would have understood. It wasn't clean lines and bright colors. Bobby made collages. He would scour the streets for trash, for discarded magazines, for broken bits of metal and wood. He would cut them up and reassemble them into chaotic, fractured landscapes. They were visual representations of his own mind, pieces of a shattered reality glued together in a desperate attempt to make a whole. He wrote poetry, too. Dark, beatnik verses that scribbled across the page like scars. He would sit in the smoky cafes of Greenwich Village, reading his work to anyone who would listen. He was searching for a new tribe, a group of people who valued broken things. And inevitably, his search led him to the one place in New York that collected human wreckage and called it art: the Factory. The Factory was Andy Warhol's studio, a silver-lined loft that served as the Vatican of the underground. It was a place where superstars were manufactured overnight, where drag queens, socialites, and hustlers mingled in a drug-fueled haze of creativity and boredom. Bobby Driscoll drifted into this orbit. There is a profound, sickening irony in this transition. Bobby had been the prince of the original factory, the Disney studio, a place of corporate perfection, wholesome values, and rigid control. Now he was seeking refuge in the anti-Disney, a place of subversion, decay, and absolute moral ambiguity. Walt Disney wanted to make the world believe in magic. Andy Warhol wanted to show the world that magic was just a commodity, like a soup can. For a brief moment, Bobby found a strange kind of acceptance there. To the factory crowd, Bobby Driscoll was a curiosity. He was a piece of pop culture history that had walked in the door. They knew who he was. They knew he was the voice of Peter Pan. But in Warhol's world, being a washed-up child star wasn't a liability. It was an aesthetic. It was camp. It was tragic. And tragedy was fashionable. He appeared in one of Warhol's underground films, a movie titled Dirt. The title alone feels like a punchline to his life story. The boy who had starred in Song of the South and Treasure Island was now starring in Dirt. The film is experimental, gritty, and largely unwatchable by mainstream standards, but it captures Bobby in his final transformation. He looks haunted. He looks like a man who is fading away in real time. But the factory was not a family. It was a collection of vampires. Warhol was a voyeur who watched people destroy themselves and called it art. Bobby, with his deep-seated need for a father figure, was looking for another Walt. He wanted someone to tell him he was good, that he was special. But Warhol didn't do reassurance. He offered indifference. And when the novelty of having Peter Pan around wore off, when Bobby's addiction made him too erratic even for the underground, the circle closed. He was pushed to the periphery again. By 1967, the brief flicker of his artistic reinvention had been extinguished. The heroin, which had been a coping mechanism in Los Angeles, became a full-time occupation in New York. The city is a cruel host to the addicted. It requires a constant hustle. Bobby became a ghost of the East Village. He was seen wandering Tompkins Square Park, a shuffling figure in a heavy coat, his hands trembling. He stopped making art. He sold his collages for a few dollars to buy a fix. He sold his clothes. He eventually lost his apartment. The descent into homelessness was not a sudden event, but a slow erosion of dignity. He began sleeping on friends' couches, then in hallways, and finally in the abandoned buildings that dotted the neighborhood. This was the era of the vanishing. People in the scene noticed he was gone, but in the chaotic world of the late 60s, people vanished all the time. They went to rehab, they went to jail, or they just drifted away. No one realized that Bobby hadn't just drifted. He had fallen off the edge of the earth. He stopped contacting his family. The last letters to his mother, Isabel, had been sporadic and confusing, filled with grand plans that never materialized. Then the silence set in. Isabel, back in California, could feel the cord snapping. She called the police. She called the FBI. She placed ads in the New York papers. Information wanted regarding Robert Driscoll. But New York is a city of 8 million stories, and it swallowed Bobby's story whole. There is a specific kind of loneliness that exists in a crowd, and Bobby Driscoll drowned in it. He was surrounded by millions of people, yet he was completely unreachable. He would sometimes tell people in bars who he used to be. I was Peter Pan, he would slur, his eyes unfocused. I was the Disney kid. Most people didn't believe him. They saw a derelict, a junkie with bad teeth and dirty fingernails. They thought it was just the delusion of a madman. Others, the ones who looked closely and saw the faint ghost of the boy in his face, would look away in horror. It was too uncomfortable to reconcile the image of the flying boy on the movie screen with the trembling wreck asking for spare change. It was easier to think he was lying. In late 1967 and early 1968, the winter in New York was punishingly cold. Bobby's health was collapsing. Years of needle use had ravaged his veins. They had collapsed, forcing him to inject into his legs, his feet, anywhere he could find a line. He had developed hepatitis. His heart, weakened by the strain of the drugs and the malnutrition, was failing. He was 30 years old, but his body was that of a geriatric. He retreated further into the shadows. He found sanctuary in the abandoned tenement at 371 East 10th Street. It was a shooting gallery, a place where addicts went to use and sleep off the high. It was a place of utter desolation, a building that had been condemned by the city but was still teeming with the life of the desperate. This was his Neverland now. No mermaids, no pirates, no pixie dust. Just peeling paint, the smell of urine, and the biting wind coming through the broken windows. He lay on a cot in a vacant room, surrounded by the detritus of his existence, a few religious pamphlets he had picked up, perhaps looking for a final answer, and empty bottles of beer. In those final weeks, as he lay in the dark, one has to wonder if the memories returned. Did he dream of the Burbank lot? Did he hear the applause of the Academy Awards? Did he feel the phantom sensation of the harness lifting him into the air on the soundstage? Or was the silence of the tenement so heavy that it crushed the past completely? He was the boy who had been promised eternal youth, and in a twisted, horrific way he was about to get it. He would never be old. He would never be 40. He would never have gray hair. He would be frozen in this moment of absolute ruin. The industry had thrown him away because he grew up, and now he was about to commit the final act of rebellion. He was going to stop growing forever. The transition from Bobby Driscoll, struggling artist, to John Doe happened in the quiet dark of March 1968. There was no audience. There were no cameras. Just a heart that had beaten too fast for too long, finally slowing down to a stop. The film ran out. The screen went black, and the city outside continued to roar, completely unaware that the magic had just died in a basement on East 10th Street. 2 weeks before he died, Bobby Driscoll was reportedly seen by a former acquaintance on the street. The friend barely recognized him. Bobby was frail, shaking, looking like a man made of paper. The friend asked him how he was doing. Bobby reportedly smiled, a faint, ghostly echo of that $1 million grin, and said, "I'm getting it together. I'm going to be okay." It is the lie that every addict tells, and perhaps the lie that every doomed man needs to believe. He wasn't getting it together. He was coming apart. He walked away into the crowd, blending into the gray coat of the city, vanishing into the fog. That was the last time anyone who knew his name saw him alive. He didn't fly away to a star. He walked into a tomb. And when the door closed behind him, it locked with a finality that not even Walt Disney could rewrite. The silence of the grave is usually a metaphor, but on Hart Island it is a physical weight. It is a silence so heavy that it presses down on the earth, suffocating the stories of the million souls buried beneath its soil. Located at the western end of Long Island Sound, this desolate strip of land has served New York City as a prison, a lunatic asylum, a tuberculosis sanatorium, and finally, as a potter's field. It is the city's filing cabinet for the forgotten, the unwanted, and the unclaimed. And in the spring of 1968, it became the final resting place of the boy who had once owned the keys to the Magic Kingdom. The journey from the tenement on East 10th Street to the trench on Hart Island was a bureaucratic procession of indignities. When the police removed the body of John Doe from the cot, there was no investigation. In a city seizing with crime, a dead junkie in an abandoned building was not a mystery. It was a statistic. He was zipped into a body bag, a dark cocoon for a butterfly that would never fly again, and transported to the morgue. The medical examiner looked at the ravaged body and saw only the clinical evidence of a wasted life. The arteries were hardened, the liver was scarred, and the heart that had once raced with the excitement of winning an Oscar, was occluded, blocked by the sludge of years of abuse. The cause of death was officially listed as occlusive coronary arteriosclerosis, but that was just the medical terminology for a broken heart. There were no cameras to record his exit. There were no fans weeping behind police barricades. There was only the cold fluorescent hum of the morgue and the scratch of a pen on a death certificate. Because he carried no identification, and because his face was a mask of decay that bore no resemblance to the cherubic child of the 1940s, he remained anonymous. The morgue held him for the statutory period, waiting for a mother, a wife, or a friend to claim him. But Bobby Driscoll had spent the last years of his life dismantling his connections to the world. He had hidden himself so effectively that even in death, no one could find him. When the time ran out, the city of New York took over. He was placed in a simple pine box, rough-hewn and unvarnished. He was loaded onto a ferry, the Michael Cosgrove, which makes the grim pilgrimage to Hart Island. There, a crew of inmates from Rikers Island prison acted as the pallbearers. It is a final bitter irony that the boy who had spent time in Chino prison was buried by prisoners. They lowered his box into a mass grave, a long trench cut into the hard earth, and stacked him 3 deep with strangers. There was no headstone. There was no name, just a marker with a number 177. The boy who had been immortalized in ink and paint, whose voice was preserved forever on celluloid, was now just a number in a book of the dead. The dirt was shoveled over the box, and Bobby Driscoll vanished from the surface of the earth. But while Bobby lay in the cold ground of New York, a different kind of tragedy was playing out 3,000 miles away in the sun-drenched suburbs of Los Angeles. A mother was waiting. Isabel Driscoll was living in a suspended state of agonizing hope. She knew her son was troubled. She knew he was an addict. But the bond between a mother and her child is a stubborn thing, resistant to logic and reality. She had lost contact with him in late 1967. The letters had stopped. The phone calls, which were usually frantic requests for money, had ceased. At first she told herself that no news was good news. Perhaps he was clean. Perhaps he was working. Perhaps he was finally, as he had promised so many times, getting it together. But as the months turned into a year, and the year dragged on into 1969, the silence became a siren. Isabel began a desperate, one-woman manhunt. She wrote letters to the New York Police Department. She placed advertisements in the Village Voice and other New York papers, pleading for information. Information wanted concerning Robert Driscoll, the ads read, accompanied by an old photo of a smiling young man who no longer existed. She sat by the phone in her California home, jumping every time it rang, praying to hear his voice. Every day that passed without a call was a torture session. She was haunted by the image of her son alone in the big city, cold and hungry. She had no idea that he was beyond hunger, beyond cold, beyond pain. She was grieving for a living ghost, unaware that she was actually searching for a corpse. By the autumn of 1969, nearly 19 months after Bobby had died, Isabel's desperation forced her to do the unthinkable. She realized she needed help that was more powerful than a mother's love. She needed leverage. She needed connections. So she swallowed her pride, picked up the phone, and called the one place that had both made and destroyed her son. She called the Disney studio. Imagine the conversation. the mother of the studio's first human star, the woman who had once sat in Walt's office while he praised her boy, was now begging a secretary for a favor. She asked if the studio could use its contacts with the FBI to help find Bobby. It was a humiliating request, a final admission that the family was broken and powerless. To their credit, or perhaps out of a sense of corporate guilt, the studio agreed. They contacted the FBI. The Bureau didn't need to launch a manhunt. They just needed to check the files. They ran a search for Bobby's fingerprints, prints that were on file because of his arrests in California. The match came back with terrifying speed. The fingerprints of the John Doe found in the East Village tenement in March 1968 were identical to the fingerprints of Bobby Driscoll. The news traveled down the wire from New York to Washington to California, and finally to the Driscoll home. It arrived just days before Christmas 1969. Isabel was told that her search was over. She was told that the boy she was waiting for had been dead for a year and a half. She was told that he was buried in a pauper's grave on an island of convicts. The devastation was total. It wasn't just the death, it was the duration of the deception. The world had continued to turn, children had continued to watch Peter Pan, and the industry had continued to churn out profits, all while Bobby had been rotting in an unmarked pit. The finality of Hart Island meant there would be no funeral, no viewing, no bringing him home. The city of New York does not exhume bodies from the potter's field easily or cheaply. Bobby Driscoll was part of the island now. When the story finally broke to the public in 1971, upon the re-release of Song of the South, it was treated not as a tragedy of the system, but as a scandalous curiosity. The headlines were lurid: the Disney tragedy. Peter Pan dies a junkie. The press, true to its nature, feasted on the contrast. They ran photos of the cute, wide-eyed Bobby next to the mugshots of the ravaged addict. They turned his life into a cautionary tale, a morality play about the perils of fame and drugs. But they missed the point. The story of Bobby Driscoll was not about a bad kid who made bad choices. It was about an industry that treats children like disposable batteries. It was about a culture that worships youth but despises the process of aging. It was about a studio system that legally owned a child's childhood and then sued him for breach of contract when he grew up. The reaction from Hollywood was a deafening silence. There were no tributes from the Academy. There were no tearful speeches from studio heads. Walt Disney had died in 1966, 2 years before Bobby, so there was no comment from the patriarch. The machine simply kept moving. New child stars were hired. New contracts were signed. The Driscoll rule would eventually be discussed, regulations to protect child actors. But for Bobby, it was too late. He was the sacrifice upon which the altar of child stardom was built. Today, if you go to Hart Island, you cannot visit his grave. The island is restricted, a place of secrets and sorrow. But if you could stand on that wind-swept patch of earth, you would be standing on the greatest paradox in Hollywood history. Beneath the dirt lies the boy who represents eternal youth. The voice that tells us dreams do come true belongs to a body that was thrown away like garbage. We watch Peter Pan now with a different kind of awareness. When Peter flies through the nursery window, cutting his shadow loose, we are seeing Bobby Driscoll. When he fights Hook with that cocky, arrogant grin, we are seeing the spirit of a boy who believed he was invincible because the world told him he was. And when he says, "I won't grow up," it is no longer a triumphant cry of freedom. It is a terrifying prophecy. He kept his promise. He didn't grow up. He stopped at 31. A broken, hollowed-out version of a man, frozen in time. But in the dark, flickering light of the cinema, he is still 12 years old. He is still flying. He is still the favorite son of the Magic Kingdom. trapped forever in the moment before the fall. The corpse in the tenement was not just a victim of heroin. He was a casualty of a business model that mines the innocence of children and leaves them with nothing but the silence when the mine runs dry. Bobby Driscoll found his Neverland, but it wasn't the second star to the right. It was a wooden box in a cold trench where the only pixie dust was the dirt thrown by a prisoner's shovel. Years after his death, a story emerged from the archives of the Disney studio. It is said that during the production of Peter Pan, the animators complained that they couldn't get the facial expressions right for the scene where Peter is stranded on Marooner's Rock, believing he is about to die. They couldn't capture the look of genuine, hopeless fear on a boy's face. Walt reportedly told them to look at Bobby. "He's got it in his eyes," Walt said. "He knows what it looks like to be alone." It was a compliment to his acting, but it was also a diagnosis. Bobby Driscoll always knew. He carried the loneliness with him, like a shadow, from the sound stages of Burbank to the streets of the East Village. In the end, the camera captured it, the audience applauded it, and the world ignored it until it killed him. The Lost Boy was never just a character. It was the only role he was ever truly allowed to play. The tragedy of Bobby Driscoll is not that he died. It is that he was never truly allowed to live. He was a vessel for our fantasies, and when the vessel cracked, we threw it away. But the voice remains. High, clear, and haunting, it echoes through the decades. A ghost story disguised as a fairy tale, whispering the terrible truth of the magic kingdom. You can fly, but only until the ground rushes up to meet you.